Right, hello folks. Let's get cracking with a new series looking at the forgotten defenders of the home front during the Second World War. As always, with these videos, I'm using a script, so I might be looking off to this side. But these scripts help me to get across everything I'm wanting to say. So I provided an introductory video a couple of months back looking at what I wanted to achieve with the series and also giving a background of how I was going to achieve this series. But I decided to start this series, as I'm sure you're aware, to provide a summary of the units that were key to defending the UK during the 1940s, but now don't get a look in within modern historical narratives. As always, this series will aim to break down the Duff history and misconceptions that surround the Home Guard and show which units were actually doing the role that is now assigned traditionally to the Home Guard. So ideally, I want to highlight units that have been completely forgotten, show that they were doing roles that today are seen as a Home Guard role, for example, but also draw attention to, some of the much needed or draw some focus to the much needed history of certain units that today are largely forgotten due to ahistorical narratives associated with the Home Guard. So let's start this series off by looking at the Young Soldiers Battalions. Just to be quite open and off the bat, this isn't going to be a definitive and detailed history of these units, as the information is not readily available. I was quite surprised when I started to look into this that pretty much all the information I can find is from primary sources, for example. So what I do want to do though with this video is highlight the battalion's broad structure and role, while providing some real-world examples of what these units got up to in the UK, primarily in East Anglia, because that's where my main focus has been, and this is where where I've encountered these units for pretty much the first time. So although the focus of this video is not going to be all-encompassing, it should give a decent insight into the role of these units across the UK, but be aware that research is needed to confirm this at a much more local level outside of Norfolk. So as with all these units, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all story, no one-size-fits-all narrative, and the only way to break down the picture and get an idea of what was going on with these units is for people to actually do their own research through primary sources at a local level. Right. Let's start off with, as usual, a quick summary of the sources I'll be using in this video. So, as I've already mentioned, I was quite surprised that there is actually little in the way of readily available, accessible information regarding the Young Soldiers Battalions. So their role and history is likely to have been all but forgotten. As a result, I'll be using some of the war diaries that I have available for the units of the Young Soldiers Battalions, as well as literally one secondary source, which I'll be providing the references for these at the bottom of the slides where relevant. So pretty much the only primary source that I could find during my initial search for information was within Dr. Gordon Barclay's book If Hitler Comes, which is a bloody good book. And literally on page 27, there's a very short summary of the history of the Young Soldiers Battalions, which I'll quote from shortly. But yeah, do check out that book, as it provides one of the best pieces of work into the defence of the UK, providing a detailed look at how Scotland was to be defended during the Second World War. And it outlines very well the key importance of drawing together archaeological fieldwork and documentary research to build up the actual picture of defence in the UK, rather than just assuming that everything was done by the Home Guard. Okay. So let's start with the basic stuff. So who were the Young Soldiers Battalions? Well, let me just state here for clarification that these were not cadet units. Cadets are something completely different. And I also want to highlight again that I only stumbled across these units when looking through the war diary for the 8th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment. So finding these units and a mention of them was quite by chance. I had no idea these units existed, and I came across them, you could say by accident, and then I realised what their role was and that it needed. I needed to look into their role in more detail at a local level, which is where I went from there. But my research into these units is still very preliminary. So, as I've already mentioned, Gordon Barclay's book. So, on page 27, according to Barclay in If Hitler Comes, the young soldier battalions were battalions formed of young men, generally under the age of 18. That's what it states in the book. So I found primary source evidence, which is this little newspaper snippet which was in a war diary for the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment, which points to the age range being from 18 to 20. I think it does it say that? Yeah, so it is believed the first to be completed under the scheme for training 18 to 20-year-old volunteers, and their volunteer status is a matter of no little pride to every soldier of the unit. So although Barclay says under the age of 18, this primary source here, which is the newspaper snippet from the time, points to the age range being from 18 to 20. So I'll use that as the age range for these units. Soldiers of the age between 18 to 20. Because obviously they'd have to be over the age of 18 to actually undertake a combat role. So apparently, again, according to Barclay, these units were formed of young men from a range of backgrounds as well, including public schools and reform schools. So Borstalls and things like that. So I find this quite interesting because what you find is toffs mixing with toughs, which I like to call it. As well, according to Barclay, these young soldiers battalions would generally be larger than their frontline equivalents, their frontline battalions. So numbers in the young soldier battalions would be in the region of a full complement of 1,200 soldiers for the young service battalions, which is compared to about 800 soldiers for a regular battalion. And what makes this really quite easy to spot these units now is if you're aware of this, each of these young soldier battalions would be numbered the 70th Battalion in their respective regiments. So whenever you see 70th Battalion, let's say Royal Norfolk Regiment, 70th Battalion, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, that is the young soldier battalion in that regiment. So that makes these things really easy to spot, which is quite cool. And that is literally all the information that I've been able to find in secondary sources. Granted, I've not looked at every single book that I have because I didn't see the point. I was going to focus on local examples and using primary source documents anyway to get an idea, but that is literally the only summary I was able to find in Gordon Barclay's book, which is literally just a couple of paragraphs, and it compares them next to the Home Defence Battalions, who I'll be looking at in a later video. Right. So with that out of the way, what was the role of these young soldiers battalions? I'm going to keep on saying young service battalions, and I don't know why. So this may come as a bit of a surprise to anyone that has been led to believe that the Home Guard defended airfields, but the young soldier battalions were specifically formed to have the primary role of airfield defence. Simple as that. We'll look at the reasons for this later. So the 8th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment's War Diary, which is where I found out about these units, provides some useful information about the formation and role of the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment. Remember, I've already mentioned that the YSBs, Young Soldier Battalions, were number 70 in the regiment. And again, this is only going to be an insight into some local units and may not reflect other YSBs across the UK. And again, what I want to reiterate, this is why local research is needed. So, the 8th Battalion Royal Norfolk's War Diary presents information regarding the formation of the 70th Royal Norfolk Regiment around mid-September 1940. And I think this gives us also a general date for the formation of these units nationally. I've got a couple of other units I'll be looking at later in this presentation, and this date of, let's say, the 14th of September 1940 seems to be the point where these units started to be formed. So still in 1940, still within the key invasion threat periods, but later than, it was clearly after they deployed the regular and territorial army in June and July 1940 that the War Office, Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, etc., saw that there was a need for additional troops to defend airfields. Okay. So let's start by looking at unit composition. I've already mentioned before that, according to Barclay, these units were larger, so the young soldier battalions were larger than the standard infantry battalion, so they would have had 1,200 soldiers compared to 800 soldiers of a regular armoured battalion. So this interesting document here is titled Youth Companies, and again, this is in the 8th Battalion Royal Norfolk's War Diary, and this provides a not very clear summary of some information that was sent out by the War Office, which put out the initial information regarding the formation of the Young Soldier Battalions on the 4th of September 1940. This document doesn't include that original War Office statement, but I'm sure if you find the specific War Office file, this would have the memorandum or the information that went out. But to try and summarise this little document here as best I can, because this document seems to contradict itself, it's not very clear. It's clearly a very initial outline for what these young soldier battalions would consist of. So the document outlines that new battalions should not be formed until full-strength youth companies have been formed, with each battalion comprising 6 full-strength companies of 6 platoons each. So a platoon, a company is in the regular army 140, 150 soldiers. A platoon is 28 to 30. I'll let someone else do the maths on that, but I'm sure. So, and also generally a regular or territorial army company, battalion would comprise of 4 companies, I think it is, each with 3 platoons each, something like that. It's not relevant, but you can clearly see the numbers here are quite a bit larger than the standard infantry battalion and platoon and company. Apparently, as well, according to this document, the number of companies to be formed would not be restricted to the number of airfields to be defended. So I think what they're trying to say there is, if an area had 8 airfields, they wouldn't form, 8. No, let's say no. If an area had four airfields to be defended, they wouldn't just form 4 companies. They would still have to meet this allotment of 6 full-strength companies, let's say. I think that's what they're trying to say there. So this would have allowed standardisation across the UK in terms of these units. Interesting as well, Section 3, which is this one here, also mentions boys' companies, which were formed for airfield defence, which is something I've not encountered. I so far haven't come across those within the war diaries that I have, but I'm going to have to keep an eye out now, because that's interesting. That seems to be a precursor to the Young Soldier Battalions in the form of these boys' companies, which were specifically formed for airfield defence. I don't know if this is a local thing, a national thing. I don't know whether this is something that never filtered down to Norfolk, and I've not seen this in East Yorkshire either. I need to keep an eye out for Young Soldier Battalions in East Yorkshire as well, because I've not done that just yet. Anyway, I'm not 100% sure if these boys' companies are a national thing or a very localised thing that found their way into this War Office file. Also mentions here that if these new battalions became so large they became unwieldy, so in other words, if they got so many troops and they became so large that they became hard to control, then it recommends that they should be split along the lines of the Home Defence Battalions. So using the Home Defence Battalions as kind of the basis for the organisation of these Young Soldier Battalions, but also making it very clear here, in my words, that these Young Soldier Battalions were not the same thing as a Home Defence Battalion. They were their own thing. Initially, I thought these were a subset of Home Defence Battalions, but clearly they aren't. They are their own separate entity, which is what in my next video I'll look at the Old Soldier Battalions, and I think it's going to be the same situation with them. But information on Old Soldier Battalions is even more limited than the Young Soldier Battalions, and they might just be a specific thing to Norfolk. I can't state that categorically just yet. Anyway, and finally, the role of these Young Soldier Battalions would not be restricted by the War Office to just airfield defence. So although I've mentioned their key role was airfield defence, this initial document makes it very clear that they would also be doing other things, so vulnerable point defence, nodal point defence, and the like. It's just in my research so far, the vast majority of these units were defending airfields, so I'm going to use that as their primary defensive role. So overall, this actual little document is clear as mud, but the key points that I can work out are that Young Soldier Battalions would supersede boys' companies where they were formed. Battalions would comprise of 6 companies of 6 platoons each, and they would defend airfields, but wouldn't just be restricted to defending airfields. They could defend other static points as well. Okie doke, same source, 8th Battalion War Diary. On the 22nd of September 1940, this document here was issued to station commanders of RAF airfields within the 2 Corps area. So the 2 Corps area comprised pretty much the entirety of Norfolk, parts of Cambridgeshire, the Fens, a bit of Suffolk, the northern end of Suffolk, and all the way inland to Bedfordshire. So quite a large area. So this document here, this communication to station commanders, outlined that units of the 52nd Infantry Division, which was the 52nd Lowland Infantry Division, a Scottish TA unit which had been pulled out of the fighting in France and deployed to Norfolk. They were going to go and move elsewhere in September 1940, along with the 37th Infantry Brigade. So they'd be withdrawing from Norfolk, and they would need to be replaced by Old Soldiers Battalions. So these were the 8th Battalion Norfolk Regiment and the 17th Beds and Hertfordshire Regiment, as well as the 70th Battalions of the Royal Norfolks and the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiments. So they're those regiments, Young Soldier Battalions. So clearly here, the 52nd Infantry Division and the 37th Infantry Brigade, who were tasked with airfield defence prior to September 1940. I've got the war diaries for one of those, well, the 52nd. But clearly they were pulling out, they were going to be deployed elsewhere. I think the 52nd were going back to Scotland. Fairly certain of that. But as a result, this would mean that the airfields would need soldiers for defence. And this was kind of like the perfect timing for the formation of the Young Soldier Battalions and the Old Soldier Battalions. So they could take on this role, freeing up additional division troops and taking on the role that was allotted to Territorial Army troops of the 52nd Infantry Division. So yeah, we're seeing this information going out to RAF station commanders that these units are pulling out. They're going to be replaced with old and young soldiers battalions. Make provision for these to come in. So the station commanders were made aware that the young soldier battalions were intended to take the formation of the Young Soldier Battalions was intended to take place on the 19th of September 1940, but was postponed until the 15th of October 1940, which is quite interesting. I'm not sure if this is a universal thing or if this is a Norfolk thing. The aforementioned battalions would be taken on airfield defence upon their formation, which would take place the following the following month. And airfield station commanders would be required to prepare for this, as well as provide suitable winter accommodation for these units. So clearly these units would be undertaking airfield defence across winter 1940 into 1941. What's also interesting here is that this document mentions the LAs, which I'm fairly certain is light automatics or light machine guns, which we'll use for this. The document mentions that light machine guns would be required to replace any that would be taken by the outgoing troops. So obviously the outgoing troops would have their own light machine guns and they would take them with them. So the commander of 2 Corps who issued this document would be looking to source LMGs from those currently being issued to the Home Guard. So that's really interesting. They were going to pull light machine guns from the Home Guard to issue them to the Young Soldier Battalions and the Old Soldier Battalions going into airfield defence. But this clearly shows the hierarchy here of military defence. So the Home Guard clearly sat below the Young Soldier and Old Soldier Battalions in terms of military hierarchy. And although they were being issued with LMGs, it was much more important to arm the Young Soldier Battalions and the Old Soldier Battalions who would be coming in to take on the role of airfield defence. So Home Guard were very much way down the pecking order in terms of armaments, and it's what you'd expect anyway, because the Home Guard were not intended to be a full-time fighting unit at any point in 1940. So they didn't require these weapons because they might not even be called out to use them. These weapons are better off going to troops who are going to, if the balloon goes up, take a more active fighting role. Right. So on the 27th of September 1940, we have additional clarification coming in the form of this document, which outlines the formation of the Young Soldier Battalions. What this does is draws together all that information that we've seen already and also outlines how Young Soldier Battalions are going to be formed at a local level. So it clarifies some of the things that were already said, but it primarily clarifies that the formation locally of the Young Soldier Battalions was postponed from the 19th of September. This is what the document says, to the 15th of October, and the battalions would comprise 6 companies of 6 platoons each. Interestingly here as well, I only put this in because it mentions something quite interesting in terms of 1 company of young soldiers from the 6th Battalion Suffolk Regiment will be incorporated into the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment, and this is likely due to issues with local strength, so possibly the Suffolk Regiment weren't able to raise their required allotment of young soldiers to form their own independent battalion. So this 1 company that was formed was incorporated into the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment, which is quite interesting. I'd like to look into this further elsewhere to see whether this happened elsewhere with other units of the Young Soldier Battalions. But I thought I'd just stick that in just to show that later on in the month, all this information was finally clarified. Plans were put in place how this was going to be implemented at a local level. And yeah, we also see the incorporation of an additional young soldier company from a different battalion into the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment. How that went down in terms of local rivalry, I don't know. We might find out in the future. Okay. So as we've seen, hopefully this gives you an idea of the process of forming these units, their general, very broad composition, and the dates of when they were formed. So clearly the process of forming these units was around mid-September 1940. And the example from the 8th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment War Diary gives us some information as to how this unit was formed locally and what their local defensive roles were. So let's come on to the 70th Battalion Royal Norfolk Regiment, which 70th indicates they are the Young Soldier Battalion. really like this image. This image popped up in the war diary. It's clearly out of a newspaper somewhere. I need to trace this newspaper, but it shows this actual unit in training in Norfolk, which is really, really cool. Okay, so the 70th Royal Norfolk Regiment came into being on the 19th of September, on paper at least. So the war diary starts around the 19th of September. You can see the formation process is going in to form the unit. So officers are allotted, places for accommodation are been outlined, headquarters have been arranged, and all this stuff. Upon their formation, then, the unit was outlined to be deployed to defend RAF stations, as they're called in the documents. I'm sure these are airfields, but I'm going to call them RAF stations because I can guarantee if I call a radar station a airfield, someone will kick off. But upon their formation, they were tasked with taking on the defence of RAF stations Watton, Feltwell, Horsham St Faith and Bircham Newton. As of the 20th of September, their strength was 30 officers and 790 other ranks, but they would be working up to a strength of 32 officers and 1,428 other ranks. So I think that just about tallies with what Barclay said. It's a bit more, but not too far off the mark. It could be local reasons why they had this higher number. So we can see that on the 20th of September, the unit was not necessarily at full strength, but at this initial point was a sizable unit for defending a total of 4 airfields. It was pretty much on line with the size of a regular infantry battalion. So I need to still read their war diary in detail, which isn't easy, as the first 5 or 6 months of the war diary are all handwritten. The handwriting is really scrappy, so it's really difficult to read, but I've just picked out the key bits of information here. So eventually the 70th Royal Norfolks would also go on to defend RAF Coltishall in late 1940 and various other airfields. They spent a lot of time kind of moving around the county, which is something I'm going to work on, do some GIS and mapping where the airfields were and when they were defending them. But again, this is just meant to be a broad overview. So coming into 1941, the battalion was still defending airfields in Norfolk, but also undergoing training, actual education through lectures as well. So alongside their active defensive role of defending airfields in Norfolk, they were undergoing additional training to prepare them potentially for deployment elsewhere and moving on to professional army units, but also being educated as well. So the war diary continues with this process of defending airfields and various other bits and pieces going on. And this war diary only runs up until the 31st of December 1941, which is the cut-off point for general war diaries of this period. So even at this time, towards the end of 1941, the units are still in Norfolk defending airfields. And it's quite nice that there is something about couple of interesting events that went on around this time, but the war diary concludes this rather positive message, which is the battalion has certainly come onto the map, and the difference since December 31st 1940 is amazing. May 1942 see even greater strides, and the move towards the unit becoming a field force battalion realised. So I haven't got the war diaries for 1942 and onwards, so I can't trace the unit's activities after this date, and I might source these later war diaries in my later research. Currently I'm working up to the end of 1941. I do intend to go all the way up to 1944, but at the time being I haven't got the later war diaries for this unit, but I might pick them out later on. But this clearly shows that these units were going to continue into 1942 on airfield defence. I don't know when these units stopped being. I don't know when they were disbanded. I know from some images on the Imperial War Museum website that they've got some photographs relating to Young Soldier Battalions in late 1942, mid to late 1942, I think. So they were clearly still a thing in 1942, but when they ceased existing, I don't know, or if they did. Something for a future. Someone else can do that. Right. So also worthy of a quick mention of the 70th Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers. So they were formed near Rhyl. I love this how it says, 19th of September 1940, a baby was born in Rhyl. I love that. So they were formed near Rhyl on the 19th of September 1940. Following formation, they were sent to Skegness in late January 1941, where they would undertake rearguard duties. Elements of this battalion would go on to defend RAF Conisbee and Navenby, as well as the village of Navenby, or town of Navenby, I think it's a village, near RAF Waddington. They would also undertake the defence of RAF Digby while in Lincolnshire. So clearly they are assigned to Lincolnshire, many miles away from Wales, to undertake this role of airfield defence, but also some additional vulnerable point defence work as well. So I put the 70th Royal Welsh Fusiliers in here just to demonstrate that these young soldier battalions didn't necessarily spend much time in their local area, so they weren't formed locally and then deployed locally. According to this, they were formed and they could be expected to move anywhere to do airfield defence. So, and it's typical with this, I came across the Royal Welsh Fusiliers because I found a mention that they were defending RAF Duxford, so the famous Imperial War Museum, RAF Duxford now. And I can't find the reference, which is bloody typical, but I think the Royal Welsh Fusiliers 70th Battalion were defending RAF Duxford, and they were relieved, or they relieved the 70th Battalion Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment as well, who were deployed within 2 Corps as well. I need to try and find this because it's going to annoy me otherwise. Interestingly as well, the 70th Battalion Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment defended local airfields, but they were also spent some time defending King's Lynn, which was quite important. Right, I've got Captain Pepper making a screechy noise in the back, so let's start to draw this video to a close with one last point. So I just want to finish off with something very, very important here, which relates to my further rantings about the Blacker Bombard, better known as the Spigot Mortar today. So, in terms of the Young Soldiers Battalions, well, there's a really key piece of information here. So this bit of information itself is likely to change how the defence of airfields is perceived and revise the belief that Home Guard units defended airfields, which is something I've so far found no evidence for. Across all my research, I've found literally one mention for one airfield where the Home Guard were incorporated into the 1 mile perimeter defending, oh God, I can't remember which airfield it is, somewhere down south. And they were only incorporated into the defence of this airfield's perimeter because the Home Guard unit were within a village which fell within this perimeter. The other units there were Territorial Army units. So far I've found no evidence to show that Home Guard defended airfields in the period 1940 to 41. This doesn't mean they didn't do it, but it's unlikely. I've seen mention of Home Guard unit in Yeovil defending an airfield, but it was a factory Home Guard unit for Shorts, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, this aircraft factory unit of the Home Guard were incorporated into the defence of the factory's airfield, but that is literally the only mention of that, and it doesn't mean that this was doesn't mean this was universal. But so far, I found very little to no evidence showing the Home Guard were responsible for airfield defence in 1940 to 1942. One of the key reasons why I think this misconception has come about is because Blacker Bombard emplacements are often found on the perimeter of airfields, forming an airfield's key anti-tank defences from late 1941 onwards. So I'm now fairly certain that this belief that the Blacker Bombard was a primary weapon of the Home Guard, which I've debunked in previous videos looking at the Bombard, so seek those out. I'll post the links in the caption for the video, but I think I'm fairly certain now that this presence of Blacker Bombards in airfield perimeter defences has led people to believe that the presence of this weapon system is a direct indicator of the Home Guard defending airfields. And as a result of this, no one has bothered to try and corroborate this in any way, shape or form, and this has led to this myth that the Home Guard defended airfields just because Blacker Bombards are found on airfields. So in short, Bombards, this is the belief, is that Bombards equal Home Guard, therefore Bombards airfields equals Home Guard defending airfields. And this document clearly shows this is not the case. So in section 5, this second paragraph here, so this document is from the Blacker Bombard, it's the overall command file from the National Archives, and on the 31st of July 1941, which is just before, a couple of months before the weapon system was issued, Section 5 outlines here that this outlines and specifically mentions how the Bombard is ideal for the use of the young soldier battalions who are on airfield defence. So let that sink in. This specifically mentions young soldier battalions are ideally suited to the use of the Blacker Bombard weapon system, and that it would be issued for airfield defence to young soldier battalions. So hopefully this shows this that it is much more important than ever that we actually research local defences and not just assume that they were Home Guard responsibility. This is most likely the reason why the story of Young Soldiers Battalions has all but been forgotten today, and will continue to be forgotten if it is assumed that Home Guard defended airfields and the like. I haven't been able to corroborate when the Young Soldier Battalion ceased defending airfields, but from this we can clearly see that from the 70th Royal Norfolk Regiment, they would continue their role of airfield defence well into 1942, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Home Guard didn't take on airfield defence until 1943, which is the broad time when they start to be given a primary role of defence. Okay, after all that, and pretty much bang on 30 minutes. So just to conclude, the Young Soldiers Battalion's role was one of vital importance, as was the case with all the infantry units deployed to defend the UK. Their role is clearly focused on static airfield defence as opposed to mobile roles. This role, alongside that of the Old Soldiers Battalions and Home Defence Battalions, would have been key to freeing up soldiers of the regular and territorial army for frontline defence of the UK. The defence of airfields was clearly important, but didn't require soldiers who were fit and able to undertake the physical endurance of contemporary combat, and also be able to effectively manoeuvre and attack an invading force. But it clearly required full-time soldiers, not part-time not part-time or sub-part-time Home Guard units who would only be called out if and when they were needed. It was clear that the airfield needed to be defended on a full-time basis by relatively professional full-time soldiers. But it didn't necessarily need soldiers who were massively fit. So the Young Soldiers Battalions would have clearly prepared younger soldiers for later military service, and the records suggest that soldiers that served within the YSBs would be deployed into frontline and field force units upon reaching the top end of the required age range. So this process needs a bit more scrutiny, as it would have been a key part of feeding into the training and deployment of soldiers. But this process needs to be properly understood, and I think this is something someone else can do, because it's not really part of my wider research to understand this unit, but it'd be nice to see how the Young Soldiers Battalions fit into the wider training regime of the military at the time, in particular the infantry, and what role they took in terms of being an important part of preparing soldiers for active service in the UK and elsewhere. So this does make me also wonder what the turnover rate for the Young Soldier Battalions was, because obviously if they're meant to be within a certain age range, surely as soon as they reach 20, then they need to be going off somewhere else. They don't, you can't have like a 34-year-old soldier within the Young Service Battalions unless they're, I think Barclay mentions the First World War era sergeants and officers were meant to be commanding these units. So clearly there was meant to be an age range. They were meant to be commanded by older soldiers who didn't necessarily need a full-time role, and then the primary bulk of the work would be done by younger soldiers. So there needs to be a lot of work done to clarify what their role was and what the turnover rate was. But just to finish off, as I've already made it abundantly clear, the erroneous belief today that airfield defence was the role of the Home Guard during the period of 1940 up till 1942 at least means that Young Soldiers Battalions have all but been erased from public consciousness, and their historical importance has also been forgotten. A lot more needs to be done to properly identify and draw attention to the role of the Young Service Battalions to ensure that they are recognised, that their role is understood, and that they are properly incorporated into the local stories of how an area was to be defended. So, as always, I hope that's been useful. Next time I'm going to take a pop at the Old Soldier Battalions, but that video is probably not going to be quite as long as this one. Hopefully this has made you start to think about the Young Soldier Battalions, their role, and further mythology that surrounds the Home Guard and how we need to clear this up. And also draws more attention to how the UK was actually defended during the Second World War, which is all part of the Remember the Regulars channel remit. So, cheers folks, I'll catch you when I next get around to making a video. Thank you for watching, I'll see you next time.